Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and just dive right in to the feedback. First, I wanted to start with some glows. So I've mentioned this many times before, but something that I just continue to be so impressed that you have is the relationships that you have with students. And so it's very noticeable that your students feel safe when they're in here, and just the strong relationships that you have with kids is really awesome to observe. Accountability that you have of students too, so you have really strong rituals and routines, and because of that, like, it builds that sense of urgency that students know that they can't opt out of doing the work, and that when they come to your English class that they have to work the whole time that they're here. This lesson in particular that I got to see was the comparison of the exemplar and the non-exemplar. So that was really great work to observe. And then around the rigor piece, the modeling, the think aloud, and then naming that success criteria of what you wanted to see in their writing, and then having students engage in that productive struggle. But like, you modeled it first, so they knew what the process looked like, and then you gave them the opportunity to engage in that productive struggle, which was really cool. And then when I was looking in Whetstone and reviewing your previous action steps, the lesson was exactly what we had talked about. You had that exemplar, you defined the success criteria, and then students engaged in the peer critique. And so I'm wondering what impact you're noticing in student work as a result of the revision process that you've had students go through.
When I look at their work, I see that it does impact them somewhat. It's not like this huge jump that they make, but I feel like when they go to write next time, they feel a little bit more confident in like what's expected in each of those aspects. And I think when I looked at their work before this reteach, it was them not understanding like why we use the structure we use. So when they turned in their last ones this Monday, it was a little bit more clear to them, like why they need the elements that they need. So I think that even though it is December, they're barely realizing and understanding the value of like the structure of it. So it's become like meaningful to them, and it makes sense the why. But I still think the interpretation part is really complex, because there are a few solid things for like success criteria that you can give them, but it's really that like higher level thinking, and it's the one piece in a whole essay that you really have to like,
it's theirs.
Yeah, it's your original thought. So for them, it's really hard to come up with those. But the other pieces are starting to become more solid. I also see the time. Like for me, they need to have that whole piece for it to make sense, and I keep having to teach it in like pieces. Chunks. So it's hard for them to really practice it as a cohesive piece, and then be able to like understand why each piece goes together. So I'm still struggling with like how to get them to do that, but not wasting 50 minutes to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So what I heard you say was the impact that you're noticing is their confidence. So some of the structures that you've put in place around the peer critique, more practice doing it, and the repetition is starting to build their confidence, because they're starting to see the why. But some of the roadblocks that students are still having are with the interpretation, or just like the pieces that you're mentioning of like the context, and then you finding the time to reteach it, or to like spend time having kids really put all of their thoughts together. And so thinking a little bit more about the data piece, like you mentioned a little bit of this, but like from the data and the success criteria that you laid out for students, what are some strengths that you're noticing in their writing?
Their assertions, that they are able to like really break down that prompt and make sure that they are being specific, and they really are starting to understand that their assertion or their claim has to be defensible. It has to go back to the text. The evidence, I think it's really cool that they're starting to somewhat have an idea of like what literal versus nuanced means, and it's not like they're just picking anything. They're trying to figure out what that looks like in evidence. So those two things. And then the context seems like the easiest part, but for this group is really the most difficult, and I still don't really know why.
Okay.
Context and interpretation.
Okay. And you mentioned like that's the higher level of thinking, because it's them having to put some of their own thoughts, and they have to be creative with that.
And then it is weird because when we write, we go from like this vague but specific to like more specific but not too specific with context, and then your evidence is really specific, and then your interpretation has to be like pinpoint on. So their like ability to understand like the varying specificity of each point, and how you go from a big idea and you get a little bit more, and each piece is getting you deeper to the interpretation. That's where I feel like their biggest struggle is they want to go either too deep right away, or they go too big and it's not specific. And then in their context, they want to start giving details instead of still like a big summary. And then it's like general, specific, big, little.
And I know you've been doing a lot of work around the exemplar, and you've been using that a lot in your practice. So I think like doing a lot of that work, and like with the students that you have in your class too, like that repetition piece is what they need. And so continuing to use the exemplars and showing them what it looks like, and doing more like modeling the think aloud, because some of it for them too might be like the process that you're mentioning of like just knowing the process and what is the thinking process that they need to go through as they're writing. So thinking about the data, an action step that I'm thinking, and you know that I try to be really mindful of the action steps that I give you, because you are like super effective in your instructional moves. And so we don't need to spend a lot of time thinking about that, because you plan really well, and the way that you deliver instruction is amazing. And so I am thinking your action step around data and digging a little bit deeper into data, because you mentioned some strengths that you're noticing, and then you mentioned some roadblocks and challenges that students have. And so I'm wondering if now might be a good opportunity when you are doing your weekly lessons, if during independent practice, since you've worked so hard to build that strong rituals and routines, and that students will work and they know that they can't opt out, that during that independent practice that maybe you could start pooling some small groups to do some mini lessons and reteaches to really give them some targeted instruction based on where they're at. And like the lesson that I observed, you had students in groups, and you had strategically like put them in places where you wanted to, but like taking that one step further of like, these 5 kids really need more practice with their assertion and just giving them some more targeted and guided instruction. What do you think?
I think that would be beneficial. I think it is difficult in the sense of just planning it, because I feel like in that is another little lesson of like them needing to practice it and creating it, but I think it is meaningful and it's necessary.
Is there a way, because I understand that like that can impact planning and depending on where you are with your unit, so to make it authentic, because I don't want you to feel like you have to do something extra, but like with wherever they are with their writing, like they're writing this piece, like they're in the middle of this writing, and maybe they're doing like some revisions with it, because I don't want you to force it, but like, are you at a place in your unit or with writing that you might be able to pull and do some mini lessons like next week? I don't know where you are with that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that this week was tough. The reading was really difficult, so we spent a lot of time like trying to interpret it and break it down, but I think that next week would be doable to like take that reading and then put it into writing, because they did write. I'm not sure how good it is, but I think that I could pull them into groups and have certain groups work on certain things.
Okay, based on, and then pulling the groups, what data would we use?
I think I would use their last 2 pieces. I would definitely look at what they produced this week, but then I would also look at that last piece that they did after I did the reteach.
Okay.
So I think it's kind of easy to implement it after I do a reteach because it's the content is the same. But like now that we've switched the reading material, I want to see if they were able to transfer it. So I think looking at both of those would give me a better like overall picture.
Okay. So we probably only have time to like dive into some of the data of one of your classes. Are you done grading them, or you would still have to? Okay.
Yeah.
But we can maybe look at plans for next week at like a high level. Maybe we don't like have the nitty gritty of like the groups yet, but we could look at some of your plans for next week of like, oh, this is where I would be doing an independent practice. This would be a perfect opportunity for me to do a mini lesson.
So do you think I should still have like the reading? Like would I still have them engage in a reading, or would I still have them kind of use the reading that we did for the practice? Or could it be either one?
What do you think would be most beneficial to students at this moment of like based on what you're seeing?
I think that I would have to really look at next week's reading to really understand like where their misunderstandings are going to really be, and if that text is going to be really complex for them to get through.
Do you want to do some of that work now?
Yeah, because if it's not, I almost want to say that it would be more beneficial for them to use what we did this week. But then I feel like, is that going to be too repetitive for them to spend another week like looking at the writing stuff? Do you know what I mean? Instead of it being like the
Something
reading.
new.
Yeah, the reading, and then we like.
Well, what are you noticing with
Maybe.
your kids? Are you noticing that like, I mean, your kids never seem bored when I'm in here, but like, are you noticing that your kids are like getting a little over like the readings that you're doing, and that maybe they're ready to move on to something different?
No, I think they really like the readings. The readings are really engaging for them, and it's like social norms, so they're really into it. But I think where they're starting to get frustrated, or maybe where I see it too, and maybe it's just what I feel too, is like I keep having this end goal of they're gonna write a complete one, but I never get there. So it's like we keep doing these unfinished things because I'm teaching them in like different chunks. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm reteaching certain parts, so it's never a whole.
So I'm wondering, like, the current writing that they have and the revisions that they did, like, you know that they're still going to have holes and gaps.
Yeah.
Like, I'm wondering, like, you will do the reteaches based on that, but do they have to do like a whole nother writing piece next week? Could their writing next week be based on the mini lessons and the instruction that you give during that time?
Well, that's what I was thinking, but I don't know how I would do it, because if we did. So the lesson could either be like we look at a new reading, but that's going to trigger a new writing, right? If we go back to the same reading, what would my like main focus of that lesson be? Because I guess no, this week they did do the reading. I guess it could be like a certain part of it, which would be, so the argumentative writing automatically triggers a double ACIP, right? Because they have to give their claim and then the counterclaim. So we got through the ACIP for the claim, fine, but where they're now all stuck on is like, how do you state the counterclaim and then refute it? So that could be like the point of the reteach, but then it's just going over the structure, not so much each individual part that I did, and then when they go to write it is where I can pull those small groups.
Okay.
I think that would work.
Okay. So let's pull up